Welcome to the Center for the Study of Social Policy's Perspectives on Early Relational Health series. In the third session, we discussed the foundations of emotional connection, including the mutuality or bi-directionality of early relationships and what these healthy early relationships look like across cultures and contexts. Welcome to our third session of our Perspectives on Early Relational Health, and this is session 3, focused on the foundations of emotional connection. I'm David Willis, Senior Fellow at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and joining us today is Junlei Li, a Saul Zaentz Senior Lecturer from Early Childhood Education at Harvard Graduate School of Education is joining me. He's an innovator around communicating on simple interactions. Junlei?
Hey, David. Glad to join you today.
Let me start. As we discussed in our previous sessions, relationships matter, and early relational health is important. And it has results in safe, stable, and nurturing parent-child relationships and the many contexts and experiences that support them. All of those are central to a child's healthy development. We know that early childhood relationships are central to future mental health and well-being in children. And in many cultures, we see the beauty of these relationships. We can see and feel the emotional connection of those parent, caregiver, early childhood and child interactions. And in our health systems, where even at the individual level, we're beginning to expand careful observation of those emotional connections, even considering those as vital signs of early relational health. Some of those indicators that we can see have been captured in the Welsh Emotional Connection Scale that Martha Welsh and the Nurturing Science Center at Columbia have articulated, those of mutual attraction. That is, that gaze, touch, and proximity that we can see. Or those mutual vocal expressions, the use of vocal behavior, including tone, drawing the pair closer and closer to each other, or that mutual facial expressiveness, that sense of facial affect and expressiveness, or that sensitivity and reciprocity, the interactive patterns, that dance that we can see. These infant studies and brain neurodevelopment have all shown that these early relationships matter, and they create the foundations for the capacities of individuals to manage stress, empathy, later social emotional development. That does touch the development of the brain and the autonomic nervous system. And in some ways, some of this work's been called autonomic emotional connection. All of that we're talking about here relates to early relational health at the individual level. But of course, that process of human development and future well-being is far more complicated than that. And it's not simply only thinking about one child, one parent, or those singular concepts of attachment and bonding. We know that it simultaneously is the importance of the wider family and social connections and contexts, the health, safety, and living conditions of neighborhoods and communities within which families reside is also essential. And a family's cultural, religious, and belief and value systems all play a role in this earliest relational health pattern. And all of this is embedded in complex social and developmental experiences over time. So it's far more complicated than simply a mother and a baby, or a father and a baby, or any caregiver and a baby. It's the context that also really matter. So Junlei, can you add to this? What are your thoughts? How would you like to talk further about this space?
Thanks, David. The first thing that I just wanted to add to what you described is to take the word that you've repeated multiple times, which is mutual. Right? So how do we think about early relational health as mutual? Historically, we thought of young children's need for relationship primarily on one side, which is the young child side. It's uncontroversial to say that young children are born in need of relationships. As much as they need water, food, oxygen, they need these relationships. I think part of this idea of mutuality is that as much as young children are born with the need for relationships, adults are wired with the capacity to provide these relationships in their caregiving, in their playful behaviors, and so on. That idea ought to be as uncontroversial as it is to say that children need relationships, but often I think we operate on the assumption that adults don't have it, or that at least a significant proportion of adults don't have it. But the evidence, whether it is from caregiving practices across cultures, or the evidence more recently in the neural changes in adult caregivers as they start to take care of babies, not just in birth parents, but sometimes even in adoptive parents, where there isn't a biological clock that kicks off, but nevertheless, their caregiving part of the brain are being not only being activated, but being rewired as a result of the caregiving experience. So I think if we can start by thinking about early relational health as this mutual process, there's an inborn need on the child side, and there's an inborn capacity on the adult side to provide just what the child needs. If we start to think about the mutuality of this, I think everything else programmatically, policy-wise, start to make a lot more sense.
It's so important, that bidirectionality, that sense of the experience that both members in the interaction experience, and its importance, its value, and then, as you say, it has neurobiological impacts. It's amazing the deeper we look as to how both members in that relationship experience have powerful, resonating, deep experiences, not only physiologically, but certainly emotionally, and certainly in the way they value it. What have you seen in the work that you've been doing around simple interactions and your leadership activities?
Well, I think through our work of observing what these caregiving relationships look like, not only across different cultures, but across different contexts, not just the parent-child context, but the child care context or the preschool environment, or even in the cases of orphanage caregiving in institutionalized settings. I think what we have seen are two things. One is what we call the simple interactions, which is that all these lofty ideas we talked about, relationships, relational health, ultimately comes to and comes from the simple and ordinary interactions that adults have with children. And these simple interactions doesn't have to fit into a box. Let's say only when adults play with children do you get early relational health. In fact, the kind of quality of relationships emerges from simple things like diaper change and feeding and changing clothes. And that is particularly pronounced in the orphanages, where the caregivers, the only time they actually have with children is during bathing and changing and feeding and so on. So one is this idea that early relational health, as beautiful, powerful as it is, comes from the simplest, most ordinary interactions. And two, as you can imagine, we were talking about mutuality and the diversity of expressions that early relationship could take. So I would think that as we go across settings, go across cultures, if we're open to the possibility, we can see a wide range of expression of care when it comes to early relational health. And that as we change from culture to culture, we can see that many different people through different means can come up with adaptive ways to support the early relational health. And these forms of caregiving doesn't have to look exactly the same, but they can still serve the universal need and the functions of early relational health that's between adults and young children.
Phenomenal, Junlei. It makes me think about the long tradition in the field of psychiatry and infant mental health and psychology of attachment. And yet some of the counterpoints that have been raised about that Western culture, one child, one parent view, and yet what we're learning as we think cross-culturally. And I wonder if you have comments or thoughts about that.
I think the attachment work have laid this beautiful foundation upon which we can think about the needs of the children and the behavior of the adults to notice the needs and to adapt their own behaviors to them. I think the attachment literature or at least the understanding of attachment pigeonholes early relational health in exactly what you talked about, is we somehow picture that this would only happen within the parent-child, often the mother-child relationship, that's intense and frequent, and that lasts for many, many years. But I think if we move beyond that narrow conceptualization of attachment and look at the underlying nuts and bolts and the mechanics of attachment, what we find is that, in fact, you can see that everywhere. You can see it essentially anywhere where there's caregiving happening between adults and children, and that we can serve the functions of attachment without being rigid about the form in which it must take. So the attachment scholar and anthropologist Judy Messman, she and her colleagues have written this wonderful paper called Universality Without Uniformity.
Oh,
And I just love that phrase, right? If we think about when it comes to early relational health, when it comes to sensitive caregiving, responsive care, no matter what the concept we think about, if we ask ourselves, what is universal about the needs, about the capacities, and then at the same time say, let's not force uniformity onto how people express this care, onto how people let their care seep into the simple everyday interactions they have with children, then I think we would have taken the best of what attachment theories and research have to offer and integrate that with our understanding of early relational health without being rigid about what attachment must look like and what attachment who the attachment experience must involve.
exactly. Well, that, early relational health does require that mutuality and that sense of deep, meaningful connection, but the joy of the moment and the joy of simple interactions and with the multiple opportunities that so often young children, infants can experience, all of that trying to counter any sense of isolation, any sense of a child not having the experience of multiple social interactive opportunities. That makes me think of a couple things, and that is, how do you think about when we see, though, adults that are struggling or adults and relationships that are struggling? What comes to your mind in this kind of framing?
Yeah, I can think about a very common kind of reframing of what you described in infant mental health work. So if you see a child struggling, right, the advocacy effort in infant mental health is we need to move from asking the question, what's wrong with the child, to what happened to the child. So to your question, I was just thinking that if we see an adult struggling, whether the adult is a parent or a child care provider, or in our work an orphanage caregiver, when we see that they're not able to bring out their inborn capacity to build relationships, instead of asking what's wrong with this adult, we can ask what happened to this adult, or perhaps more urgently, what is still happening to this adult in this moment, or what is happening around the adult. I think every time that we see an adult or a group of adults who are struggling in their capacity to provide these relational care to children, something is happening to them and something is happening around them. I'll take the example of the orphanage work that we have seen not only in my home country, China, but also in Russia and Romania. The rigidity of the institutional procedures that actually exclude the opportunities for relationship building, that happens around these adults. So when we see a lack of relational kind of interactions between the adults and children, it's not so much the question kind of what is wrong with these adults, but it's a question of how can we change the structure under which these adults have to work. And I think we can take the same lens and think about family caregivers. I know for years, for example, in early childhood, we talked a lot about the language environment of low-income families. But in the if we go back 10, 20 years, I think we talked about this as if there's something wrong with the parenting that is actually happening, as opposed to, for example, examining what is happening around the adults. For
Right.
example, very historically poor and unequal housing conditions result in low-income parents often living in noisy environments, either from the street or from overcrowded housing. And you can tell, like when you're trying to communicate and pick up subtle cues from a child, if you live in a noisy environment, it makes it much harder for you to pick up these cues. It doesn't mean that you're not a good parent. It doesn't mean that you don't have the capacity as a parent, but something is happening around you that limits your capacity as a parent. So if we follow that same kind of a thread of thought, I think we can uncover a lot of things that we can impact structurally and environmentally to ultimately support the capacity of adults to care for children.
That's so on point. And, that makes me think about the future state or the solutions we're seeking. And I wonder if you could make comments about 2 or 3 key elements of systems change that you think would provide the strong support for relational health. What's your view?
I think we can start on this idea of thinking in parallel processes. So if we start with a child and we think about responsive care, what does responsive care mean? Well, it means that when the child have a need, the child can signal to the caregiver that they have a need. The caregiver then responds in a way that makes that child feel seen, heard, understood. And the caregiver then adapts their behavior. But instead of now thinking about this process as particular to infants, think about any human being that is involved in this early relational health system. They have needs and they find their ways to communicate their needs. They send us signals, sometimes even through their struggle, they're signaling to us what their need is. There has to be somebody there that can see them, that can hear them, and that can act in a way that adapts to their need. So in a way, right, in that parallel process, making sure that everybody has somebody and everybody's signal for needs is seen and heard by somebody. And if we build a system, and in that system, whether the actors are infants or the people who care for infants or the siblings of the infants, or the professionals, let's say home visitors who are supporting the infants, if everybody in that picture has somebody who can see and respond there to their need, then collectively we have a system that works.
I so agree. And in that future state, we're talking about that being connected, countering isolation, countering this whole myth of individuation and the individual is what matters, as opposed to being deeply connected in companionship and cooperative opportunities. So that's fabulous. Junlei, I have one further question for you. And that is, in a personal sense, what does this early relational health mean, this work mean to you personally? How do you think about it? And why are you here part of our journey?
I think in a personal way, David, I think about early relational health and I think about what you described earlier in attachment. I think about the experience of my 2 adopted daughters who grew up in the orphanage environment, who are cared by orphanage caregivers who, despite all the difficulties they have, provided just the kind of early relational experiences my children need so that they can thrive after they were adopted. I think of my own growing up without my parents nearby, and I was cared not by one person, but by a large network of extended families and neighbors, and the kind of early relational experience they provided for me. And so I thought that personally and professionally, I thought the most important message that we can send to caregivers in whatever capacity they are in, whatever culture they're in, is this idea that what they provide children can be enough, and that they can be enough in providing these early relational care. And anything that we can do to not only convey that message, but to support the good enough interactions and relationships they provide, is what this system in the future state ought to be able to do, ought to be able to provide. And I'm excited, I think, to be part of the community who thinks and who tries to kind of bring about this feeling of good enough relationships all around us.
Junlei, it's been great to have this conversation, and I thank you for your passion to this good work and for being with us today.
David, it's a pleasure to be with you, and it's always a pleasure to just talk about all these things with you.
All right, thanks so much.
Thank you.